person, Nehemiah, is very interesting from several respects. And we're going to look at him this morning and his character and his life from the standpoint of the 7 prayers that are recorded in the book that bears his name. But we learn in the first chapter, and as you see here, the illustration that I found, somebody's idea of what things might have looked like in those days. You see the king and the queen, and you see Nehemiah and another servant. We learn in the first chapter of the book that he was a cupbearer. He was cupbearer to the king. Now, that's a very important position. We think cupbearer, well, that's somebody, that's a server, that's a waiter. That's a very low servant. Well, that was not true. Even though the name seems like that of a very low servant, it was actually a very high position in the court and the kings, the rulers of that time. Now you think about it. If you're an absolute monarch, maybe you have 50 or 60 wives and 200 kids, there's a lot of chance that there's someone sometime wants to do you in. It might be a general who leads your troops and you get all the credit. It might be a son that doesn't like who you picked to be your successor. Or it might be a son that just doesn't want to wait for you to die. And so the cupbearer was not just a serving position, it was a position of very high trust. It had to be someone that your life might very well depend upon. And of course, often the cupbearer had to, he might have to be the cup taster. He might actually have to partake of the whatever was being served the king first to make sure it was okay. And so it was a position of high trust, and it required that you have someone in that position that you trusted, that you knew that you could trust, and that would be faithful and serve you faithfully. Now, the man that he served was Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes the first. He was the king of Persia, who reigned from about 465 to 423 or 424 BC. He was called by the Greeks the long-handed one, and the name has survived, and we call him by the Latin equivalent, long-handed, longimanus. And supposedly one of his hands was a lot longer than the other, and so the Greeks, I don't think this was a particular compliment, probably kind of an insult to name him this, but it stuck and through history, and so he's still known by this title. Now, the King Artaxerxes, there's a lot of background to the book, of course, of Nehemiah. He was the king that had allowed, a few years before, about 13 years before this, he had allowed the priest Ezra and his group to return from the captivity, to go back to Jerusalem. They had started working on the temple. They had started to worship God again in Jerusalem as the law required. And this had happened, but it wasn't without difficulties, because as happened to Ezra, so will happen to Nehemiah. There were people that opposed them and lied about them, and the work got stopped. And so it got stopped, and then it finally got restarted. But more about that later. The location of the book is the same location that we find in the 8th chapter, the vision of Daniel in chapter 8, the entire book of Esther. It is one of the many capitals of the Persian Empire that is usually known in our language as Susa. Now, many of you have Old Testaments that have Shushan. Shushan is a transliteration of the Hebrew word. It means lilies. And so if you look up lilies in or Shushan in your older translations, you'll find it mentioned in the book of Daniel, the book of Esther, and it's also where we find Nehemiah and King Artaxerxes at this time. It also appears one more time in the Psalm, because there apparently was a Hebrew melody that was named Lilies, and so it appears there also if you do that search. Now, Ezra and his group had gone back in the 7th year of Artaxerxes' reign. As the opening of the book of Nehemiah, it is now the 20th year of his reign, 20 years later, which would be about 445 BC. Now Nehemiah, so he's there. He's a Jewish captive. He has prospered. He has risen to a position of very high authority and responsibility before the king, and he's and the timeline that we see, it would be in the winter capital of Shushan, and it is the month in the Jewish calendar of Chislev. This would be our December in our calendar, but the timeline tells us as we move on in the book that it'll be later, it'll be a few months later, March, April, when other things take place. But here in the winter months, visitors come from Judea, and this sets the stage then for chapter 1 of the book. What are the conditions like in Judah? Well, as we mentioned, they had started the temple in the 2nd year of Darius, King Darius, which was about 520. Then, because of lies told to them, and they had to stop, then they had to get permission, they finally finished it in Darius' 6th year. So the temple is there, the worship of God has been reinstituted in Jerusalem, but then visitors come and they bring news from Judah, and it's not good. And that news is very bad from many standpoints, and it sets the stage for the first prayer that we read in chapter 1. But the walls of Jerusalem, even though the temple has been rebuilt, the walls of Jerusalem are still in disrepair. They're missing. The gates have been burned by the Babylonians, and all these years there are no gates on what walls there are. And so Nehemiah then makes up his mind to ask permission of King Artaxerxes to return to Jerusalem, and of course his mission is he wants to rebuild walls that are broken down, rehang gates on the gates openings, and restore Jerusalem to some sense of security. Let's look now at the long prayer of chapter 1. All the other prayers are very short, one sentence. But in chapter 1, this long prayer that begins in chapter 1, first of all, Nehemiah makes no excuses for the condition of the Jews. He knows they've been in captivity, many of them still there, but no fault of God, no fault of anyone but themselves. And so in this prayer that he utters to God, in these verses of chapter 1, he recognizes and confesses the fact that their sins had led them to the present situation. Why are they there? Why is he in Susa? Why are the Jews carried away into captivity, the northern kingdom and then Judah? Because of their own sins. He makes no excuse for it in verses 6 and 7. Let's read. Let now your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now day and night on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We've acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. No excuses there. But also, he knows not only their history, but he knows God's promises. And God's promises can be summed up in verses 8 and 9. And God's promises through Moses had always been, you be faithful, all will go well. But if you're unfaithful, you'll be scattered, and they had been. But if you return and keep and do the law, you'll be gathered together and return back to your homeland. So in verse 8 and verse 9, Nehemiah knows this, and he offers it in his prayer to God. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. So Nehemiah's prayer is not one of excuse, but is one of knowledge and recognition of the law of God and the promises of God. And so, the last part of his prayer, he has a plan in his mind. He wants God's blessing, but of course, he has to have the king's permission. So he prays, O Lord, in verse 11, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. So this is the prayer of Nehemiah. He wants the king's permission. Now, how does he go about getting it? He gets the king's permission, of course, and he gets it. He goes to Jerusalem. The king, of course, and we see in asking the king's permission to go back to Jerusalem that he wasn't just an ordinary servant. If you didn't know anything about the history of cupbearers, you get it. This wasn't just a waiter. Not only is he serving the king, but the king notices something's wrong. Well, if you were king, would you care that your whoever was serving you was not particularly happy that day? Well, only if you had a very close relationship with them. Mainly, you might just want them to get on with their work. But the king notices. He gets permission. He goes back to Jerusalem. Now, when he gets there, I've already mentioned things were very difficult there. When he gets there, if you turn now to chapter 5, we have the first of the very short prayers which he offers to God. Just verse 19, just one sentence. Remember me, O my God, for good according to all that I have done for this people. Well, Nehemiah, what did you do for the people? You've gone back there, your goal is to fix the wall, hang gates again, be able to close up the city, give it some security. That's your goal, but what about this people? Well, when he gets there, he finds there's a famine that has been going on for some time, and the people are running out of food, and in order to eat, they're borrowing money just to buy food. Well, that, when times are tough, you might have to do that. But there was also the matter of taxation. They were being forced into slavery, and Nehemiah, you notice what he says, that he actually had used his funds to redeem those Jews that were slaves when he could. One comes up for sale, he gets a chance, he had redeemed some. But this is, of course, he couldn't do it all, but he had done that. Also, the Jews, contrary to the law, were charging usury or interest, and he told them, stop it. Not only stop it, but give the interest back to them, return the property to them that you've taken as guarantee for these loans they've made just to buy food. And so these are some of the things that he had done for the people. So that's the first short prayer. But not only that, his own personal example. Now, from this personal example of Nehemiah, we see not only that he had risen to a great place of prominence in the government with the king and the position, but also he apparently had become quite wealthy, because he says for 12 years he didn't use the governor's allowance. He was appointed governor. He was leader. He didn't use the governor's allowance, but he fed at his own table, which means that he paid for it. It was not the governor's food allowance, because times were so difficult, the people were so taxed. He, from his own table, fed 150 people in chapter 5, verses 14 following. And not only does he say that, but there was always that visitor coming through, so he had to set an extra plate besides the 150 that usually showed up. So the whole palace, the whole government, apparently, that he had charge of, he fed them every day. And when you look at the list of how much food it took, and every 10th day he had a little wine to make things better, so they had a special feast that day, to feed 150 people plus any others that showed up. You can imagine the cost involved in doing something like that. So he prays his first prayer to God, remember me, O my God, for good that he'd done to the people. But what else? We talked about the opposition. Just as the temple reconstruction was stopped by opposition, so when the enemies of God's people learned that Nehemiah has as his goal to rebuild the walls and repair the gates of Jerusalem, there's opposition. And so if you turn to chapter 6, you have the second very short prayer in verse 14. Remember, O my God, Tobiah and Sanballat, according to these works of theirs, and also Noadiah the prophetess and the rest of the prophets who were trying to frighten me. They actually did with Nehemiah exactly what the others had done with Ezra in stopping the temple reconstruction. And that was, first of all, they tried to kill him 4 times. They said, come on out and meet with us. Come out here in the country, meet with us. We want to sit down and talk about this disagreement. Well, he was smart enough to know they didn't want to talk. They wanted to kill him, but they tried 4 times anyway. Then, when that didn't work, they said, well, I tell you what, if you don't stop this, we'll just write the king and tell him that Judah's planning to rebel against his authority, and that you're going to proclaim yourself king in Jerusalem, and we'll fix you that way. Well, that didn't work particularly. But then he mentions in his prayer to God about these prophets, then there's this fellow Shemaiah. Now Shemaiah told him another big lie. Shemaiah said, for something, called him to his house, and when he got there, Shemaiah said, they're trying to kill both of us, Nehemiah. Let's get out of here, let's flee to the temple, and take refuge in the temple, and there maybe we'll be safe. They're trying to kill both of us. Well, that was a lie, and Nehemiah wouldn't do that either. But they had opposition, and so in the second prayer to God, he prays that these kind of people that would stop the work of rebuilding, that God would remember them and their evil deeds. But then these 2 prayers, for the next 4 short prayers, they're all unified under one subject, and that is the restoration of the worship. When we see the temple repaired, you would think, well, the temple's rebuilt, the worship will be restarted as it should, the sacrifices will be offered, and everything will be okay. But when Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, that's not the case with the worship of God. And so the next 4 short prayers all involve restoration of things associated with the worship and the law of God that were not right, that were wrong and are being neglected. And so if you turn now to chapter 13, the last chapter of the book, we get these 4 short prayers about the worship and the service of God. Look at, first of all, at verse 14. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds which I perform for the house of my God and for its services. Well, what's going on that he had to take care of? The temple is there, and supposedly everything should be running like clockwork. But he's gone back to report to the king after 12 years. And when he gets back to Jerusalem, after going back and reporting to the king, this enemy of his and of God's people had been given one of the storerooms in the temple, apparently as a place to live, by an unfaithful priest. And so the first thing Nehemiah does when he gets back to Jerusalem is he throws all of Tobiah's stuff out of the temple, and then of course has the priests and the Levites cleanse it and restore it to its proper use. It was a storeroom. It was to hold the tithes and also the utensils that were used in the sacrificial service. And so he throws all of Tobiah's stuff out in the street and gets the room back to being used for its proper purpose. But not only that, he gets back after being gone after 12 years, and that's not the only thing wrong. The tithes have not been collected, the Levites and priests not being supported. So what do you do if you're not being supported? Well, you head for home and have to take care of yourself. You've got to go back home and farm and somehow raise food and support yourself, because the tithes are not coming in, and the Levites, so they just left Jerusalem and left the temple because they're not being supported as the law required. And so the solution, of course, to this, once the storeroom's cleaned out, Tobiah's stuff is out in the gutter, then they can bring in the tithes. And so in this prayer, he's asking God to remember what he had done, and this part of restoring the temple worship and the support of the Levites and priests that had been neglected while he was gone. That's the first short prayer about the worship. The second one is again chapter 13. It's verse 22. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me, according to the greatness of your loving kindness. Now, he gets back to town, and something else is wrong, and that is people were working on the Sabbath day. So the worship of God has just really fallen by the wayside at this time. They're worshiping on the Sabbath day, or working on the Sabbath day instead of resting. Merchants are arriving. They're coming all the way from the seacoast with fish. They're arriving on the Sabbath day to Jerusalem. They're coming on inside the city, setting up shop. And so Nehemiah locks them out, as it were, tells them to get out, and he tells them the next time they come back on the Sabbath day, the consequence is going to be a little bit more strenuous. So don't do it. Don't come back anymore. So we stop the merchandising and selling on the Sabbath day. And also, now we have a chance to close the gates, and he has the Levites purify themselves as gatekeepers, close the gates like they were supposed to at the evening as the dawn dusk, when the beginning of the Sabbath day. So close the gates, and this will stop at least the merchants coming and going and trying to set up shop on the Sabbath day, which they were not to do. So this prayer of Nehemiah takes care of the desecration of the Sabbath that had happened. Then in chapter 13, if we go to verse 29, he says, "Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites." Well, what is happening here? Well, the thing that's happening here is the people had married Gentiles, just like we read in the book of Ezra. They had married Gentiles from the nations around them, prohibited by the law. And a very interesting expression, a statement is made that half their children spoke the language of Ashdod and none spoke the language of Judah. So you can imagine coming back to a priesthood and the Levites and people that have made these unlawful marriages, and nothing was being done about it. And not only that, a grandson of the high priest was a son-in-law of this evil Sanballat, Nehemiah's enemy, one of the people trying to get Nehemiah killed. So that problem even wasn't just Levites and people, it was among the priests. And it says that he purified them of everything foreign. That's synonymous and the same thing that, of course, happened in the book of Ezra, when Ezra commanded them to put away those foreign wives that were not lawful for them to have. Let's look now at the next prayer. The last prayer of the book of Nehemiah, there's nothing associated with it but just this one sentence. Remember me, O my God, for good. 4 short prayers about his goodness, his faithfulness to God, his leadership. He's not just governor of this people, but he is a spiritual leader of the remnant that's returned to Judah. at this time. Now, as we close, let's compare ourselves. How do we stand up to the standard that Nehemiah said? It's a pretty high standard, isn't it? Do we do good to those we can help? We've been studying past weeks. We finished the book of Galatians, the fruit of the Spirit, do good. The Lord's commanded us, love our enemies, do good to those that hate us. How do we stand up to the standard of Nehemiah when it comes to doing good to others? How about when we pray? And I think about this a lot, about the preachers we support, especially, brethren, those that we support in India. The Hindu nationalist government of India is making things very difficult for Christians there. When you pray, not only pray for those preachers in India and the Philippines and other places that we support, but also pray to God about those that hate God, that hate His way, that would harm them. You know, Paul did, he warned Timothy about Hymenaeus and Alexander, and another place, Alexander the coppersmith. The Ephesians in the book of Revelation were commended by Jesus for hating the works of the Nicolaitans, which Jesus said He also hates. So we can measure up, we can come up to the standard of Nehemiah. And remember, not only to pray for those that love God, but also pray to God for those that hate Him. And we have plenty in our country that fall into this category. How about this? Are we faithful unto death? There are 4 times they tried to get Nehemiah to come out outside the city, meet with them with the intent to kill him, and then they paid someone to try and trick him into fleeing to the temple where perhaps they might kill him. Think about the first century times when you read the history of the early church. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries in particular, we've been talking this morning about the Apostle Paul, and he falls into this category, of course. We don't know how many died under Roman persecution, but when you read some of the things that they did, we know about the gladiator fights and throwing them to the wild animals. But the Romans killed unknown numbers of Christians, and it is said by historians that they often, even while being burned at the stake or burned alive, they held up their hands as long as they could to symbolize, those early Christians did, to people to know they were lifting up their hands to God even as they were being killed for faithfulness. Paul writes to Timothy, and it's something he says that's already happening. He says in 2 Timothy 4, I'm already, he was already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. Do we meet the measure, stand up to the measure standard that Nehemiah has set for faithfulness in the times of persecution? And like Caleb that Jerry talked about last week, are we zealous for keeping all the commandments of God? Not just the ones we happen to like or the ones that are easy, the ones we agree with, but like Caleb, do we fully, completely follow all the commandments of God? And of course, a lot of people like to violate the 22nd chapter of Revelation's warning. They add to, they take away from the commandments of God, and we can't do either. Do we rebuke and admonish and encourage those that are in sin? Do we apply the Scripture for teaching and reproof, for admonition, as we've been commanded to? Do we do as Galatians tells us, those that are spiritual, when we catch someone in a trespass, do we restore them back to faithfulness? And if the factious man comes along who would develop a clique for himself, a following for himself, whether he be big-name preacher or local member, do we reject the factious man, give him a warning, and after that, reject him? That's what Nehemiah would have done. And that's lessons from the life of Nehemiah. Something for us all to think about something for us all to imitate. A man that not only was he rich, not only did he prosper, not only did he get to be appointed a governor, but he used that position to restore the worship of God, to help his people, and to do what was right. This morning you may not be a Christian. You can't come up to the standard of Nehemiah until you first of all obey your Lord. If you're here this morning and believe in Jesus as God's Son, repent of your sins and confess Jesus as the Son of God, and let us baptize you into Christ as we stand and sing.